Part 3, the missionary clock. Albert Einstein said in 1953, "One need not be astonished that the Chinese sages did not make these steps. The astonishing thing is that these discoveries were made at all." Chapter 7, Open Sesame to China. Now, it was technically possible for people everywhere to find their bearings on the planet and return to the new places they would discover. But what was possible technically was not always possible socially. Tradition, custom, institutions, language, 1,000 little habits, ways of thinking and behaving became barriers. The drama of the clock in the West was not reenacted in the East. In 1577, at the Jesuit college in Rome, when the 25-year-old priest Matteo Ricci, 1552 to 1610, met a father returning from the Jesuit outpost in India, he decided to join the missions on that side of the world to garner into the granaries of the Catholic Church a rich harvest from the sowing of the gospel seed. The young Ricci had already shown the independence of spirit which would make him one of the greatest of missionaries. His father had sent him to Rome at the age of 17 to study law. Fearing that Matteo might be tempted into the priesthood, his father expressly ordered him to avoid religious subjects. Despite his father's efforts, he entered into the Society of Jesuits before he was 20, then wrote his father for approval. When the elder Ricci, hastening to Rome to withdraw his son from the Jesuit novitiate, fell sick en route, he was persuaded that this was a sign from God that Matteo should be allowed to follow his call. Matteo Ricci then left Rome for Genoa, where he sailed for Portugal to take passage in one of the annual trading ships for India. Arriving in Goa, a Portuguese enclave on the southwest coast, in September 1578, he spent 4 years studying and teaching theology. Then his Jesuit superiors assigned him to the mission at Macao, where he set about learning Chinese. Across the bay from the great commercial city of Canton, Macao seemed an ideal jumping-off place for missionaries. Ricci and his fellow priest, Michel Ruggieri, stayed for 7 years in Chao Chiing, a town west of Canton. They built a mission house, and despite popular suspicion and occasional hails of rocks from the hostile populace, they were accepted as men of learning. On the wall of the mission's reception room, Ricci mounted his map of the world. As Ricci himself reported, this is long, "Of all the great nations, the Chinese have had the least commerce. Indeed, one might say they have had practically no contact whatever with outside nations, and consequently, they are grossly ignorant of what the world in general is like. True, they had charts, somewhat similar to this one, that were supposed to represent the whole world, but their universe was limited to their own 15 provinces, and in the sea painted around it, they had placed a few islands to which they gave names of different kingdoms they had heard of. All of these islands put together would not be as large as the smallest of the Chinese provinces. With such a limited knowledge, it is evident why they boasted of their kingdom as being the whole world, and why they call it Dinia, meaning everything under the heavens. When they learned that China was only a part of the Great East, they considered such an idea, so unlike their own, to be something utterly impossible, and they wanted to be able to read about it in order to form a better judgment. We must mention here another discovery which helped to win the goodwill of the Chinese. To them, the heavens are round, but the earth is flat and square, and they firmly believe their empire is right in the middle of it. They do not like the idea of our geographies pushing their China into one corner of the Orient. They could not comprehend the demonstrations proving that the earth is a globe, made up of land and water, and that a globe of its nature has neither beginning nor end. The geographer was therefore obliged to change his design, and by omitting the first meridian of the Fortunate Islands, he left a margin on either side of the map, making the kingdom of China to appear right in the center. This was more in keeping with their ideas, and it gave them a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction. Really, at that time and in the particular circumstances, one could not have hit upon a discovery more appropriate for disposing this people for the reception of the faith. Because of their ignorance of the size of the earth and the exaggerated opinion they have of themselves, the Chinese are of the opinion that only China among the nations is deserving of admiration. Relative to the grandeur of empire, of public administration, and of reputation for learning, they look upon all other people not only as barbarous, but as unreasoning animals. To them, there is no other place on earth that can boast of a king, of a dynasty, or of culture. The more their pride is inflated by this ignorance, the more humiliated they become when the truth is revealed. Ricci's learning and tact did not allay the fears of the townspeople. One night they stoned the mission, denouncing Ricci for conspiring to bring in the Portuguese to sack the town, accused him of knowing alchemy, yet refusing to tell the people its secrets, and then destroyed the house. Father Ricci moved on northward toward Peking and the headquarters of the emperor. By tradition, the Chinese emperors kept themselves hidden from their subjects. In these last decadent years of the Ming dynasty, Emperor Wan Li, a pathological recluse, had imprisoned himself inside the Great Within, the Forbidden City, with his wives and scores of concubines, attended by uncounted eunuchs. Even his highest officials seldom saw him and had to send messages by palace eunuchs. As Ricci and his fellow Jesuits approached Peking, they were arrested and their possessions seized. The magistrate especially warned Ricci to reduce to dust and, if possible, to annihilate every sample they had in their possession of the man who was nailed to the cross. Chinese officials were horrified by the bleeding figure being crucified, which they feared as an instrument of black magic. For 6 months, the imprisoned Jesuit fathers, seeing no other hope, turned their thoughts toward God and prepared themselves resolutely and joyfully to meet any difficulty, even death itself, in the cause they had undertaken. For 20 years, Father Ricci had been trying to reach the emperor, who alone could open the way for the gospel, and he began to fear that his mission would end in a prison cell in Peking. Then out of the blue came a call from the emperor to approach the palace and be sure to bring his presents from Europe. The surprising explanation, according to Ricci, was that, quote, one day the king, of his own prompting, suddenly remembered a certain petition that had been sent in to him and said, "Where is that clock, I say? Where is that clock that rings of itself, the one the foreigners were bringing here to me, as they said in their petition?" So, Ricci was released from prison. His presents were delivered to the palace, and a gun was fired, announcing that the emperor had just received tribute. The gifts had been sent first to the Board of Rights for their advice, which was as follows. The Western Ocean countries have had no relations with us and do not accept our laws. The images and paintings of the Lord of Heaven and of a Virgin, which Li Ma Tao, Ricci, offers as tribute, are not of great value. He offers a purse in which he says there are the bones of immortals, as if the immortals, when they ascend to heaven, did not take their bones with them. On a similar occasion, Han Yu, an anti-Buddhist scholar who had been counseled on the offering of a reputed finger of Buddha, said that one should not allow such novelties to be introduced into the palace for fear of bringing misfortune. We advise, therefore, that his present should not be received, and he should not be permitted to remain in the capital. He should be sent back to his country. In spite of this, the emperor received the gifts and summoned Ricci to the Great Within. Ricci's presents included 2 elegant timepieces of the latest Italian design, a large clock driven by weights and a small clock driven by a spring. Both had been delivered to the palace a few days before Ricci's arrival, and when Ricci was summoned, the smaller clock was still running. The large clock had stopped because its weights had reached bottom. The self-ringing bells, which had so delighted the emperor, ceased to ring. The emperor, a child with a broken toy, through his chief eunuch, gave Ricci 3 days to get the clock running. Luckily, when Ricci, back in Rome, had trained for his exotic mission, he took care to be well instructed in the clockmaker's craft. Now he was prepared to give a short course in clock repair. By dint of hard work, the 4 mathematicians who were assigned to the clocks finally acquired sufficient knowledge to regulate them And for fear that something might go wrong, they wrote out every detail of the instruction and of the mechanism of the clocks. For a eunuch to make a mistake in the presence of the king is equivalent to placing his life in danger. They say the sovereign is so rigid with them in this respect that even for a slight fault, the poor unfortunates are sometimes beaten to death. Their first care was to ask for the names in Chinese of all the wheels, springs, and accessories, all of which Ricci gave them in Chinese characters, because if any parts were missing, the names of the parts would be readily forgotten. The 3 days assigned for instructions had not passed before the king called for the clocks. They were brought to him at his order, and he was so pleased with them that he immediately promoted the eunuchs and raised their wages. This they were delighted to report to the fathers, and particularly so because from that day on 2 of them were permitted to enter the presence of the king, to wind the small clock, which he always kept before them, because he liked to look at it and listen to it ringing at the time. These 2 became very important figures in the royal palace. The emperor ordered a wooden tower built for the big clock in one of the inner courtyards where only His Majesty and a few privileged dignitaries were admitted. The emperor wanted to see the strangers who had brought these machines with self-ringing bells. Yet he dared not break his custom of never appearing in the company of anyone save his immediate family, his wives, concubines, and eunuchs. Least of all could he favor foreigners over his own magistrates. Instead of calling the fathers into his presence, he sent 2 of his best artists to paint their full-length portraits. During the next 9 years, Father Ricci became a quite different kind of emissary than he intended. The emperor's clock struck all the Chinese dumb with astonishment, Ricci explained, simply because it was a work the like of which had never been seen, nor heard, nor even imagined in Chinese history. But Ricci was wrong. Although the fathers did not know it, the mechanical clock already had a long and remarkable history in China. 500 years before the Jesuits arrived there, a few privileged Chinese courtiers were dazzled by a spectacular astronomical clock. By the time the Jesuit fathers arrived in China, that heavenly clockwork survived only as a legend known to a handful of antiquarian scholars. The building of Sun Tzu's heavenly clockwork was itself a saga. In 1077, Su Sung, a learned civil servant, was sent by the Sung Emperor of North China to offer birthday congratulations to a barbarian empire in the farther north. That year, the barbarian emperor's birthday happened to fall on the winter solstice. When Su Sung arrived at his destination, he found to his dismay that he was a day early. The barbarian calendar, it seemed, was more accurate than the Chinese. Since Su Sung dared not admit the inferiority of his own emperor's calendar, he persuaded his host to allow him to accomplish his diplomatic mission on the day he had originally intended. Back home in China, the issuing of a calendar, like the royal minting of coins in Europe, declared a new dynasty's authority. To counterfeit the calendar, or to use an unauthorized calendar, was lèse majesté. An inaccurate calendar could also spell disaster for the farmer. Astronomy and mathematics had to be confirmed to authorized persons, for others might use their astrology with help from these sciences to note when the stars were propitious to overthrow the regime. The emperor was responsible for pleasing heaven by his ordering of earthly events. When the emperor asked his returned emissary whether the Chinese or the barbarian calendar was right, Su Sung told him the truth, reads the Chinese Chronicle, with the results that the officials of the Astronomical Bureau were all punished and fined. Su Sung then received the emperor's order to design an astronomical clock more useful and more beautiful than any ever seen. Su Sung's purpose was not to make a timepiece for public convenience, but to make a calendar machine, a private heavenly clockwork for the Son of Heaven. According to your servant's opinion, there have been many systems and designs for astronomical instruments during past dynasties, all differing from one another in minor respects. But the principle of the use of water power for the driving mechanism has always been the same. The heavens move without ceasing, but so also does the water flow and fall. Thus, if the water is made to pour with perfect evenness, then the comparison of the rotary movements of the heavens and the machine will show no discrepancy or contradiction, for the unresting follows the unceasing. His, quote, new design for a mechanized armillary sphere and celestial globe was so detailed that working drawings have been prepared from it and functioning models have been made. The 30-foot-high astronomical clock tower was a 5-story pagoda-like structure. On the topmost platform, reached by a separate outside staircase, was a huge bronze, power-driven armillary sphere within which there rotated automatically a celestial globe. Outside each of the 5 stories, a procession of mannequins carrying bells and gongs was programmed to ring at appropriate hours. Inside the main tower, reaching 3 stories upward from the ground, was a huge clockwork, driven by water flowing at ground level and alternately filling and emptying the scoops on a vertical rotating wheel. Every quarter hour, the whole structure reverberated to bells and gongs, the splashing of water, the creaking of giant wheels, the marching of mannequins. The escapement that stopped and started the machine as it marked off the units of time was, of course, the crucial element. Su Sung's ingenious water escapement made use of the fluid qualities of water, as Hooke and Huygens later would use the elastic properties of metal to provide the staccato motion required in a mechanical timepiece. Those few who were privileged to view Su Sung's heavenly clockwork witnessed a mechanical fantasy, which Su Sung himself described. There are 96 jacks. They are arranged to correspond in timing with the sounding of quarters on the bell and drum floor of this belfry. At sunset, a jack wearing red appears to report, and then after 2.5 quarters, there comes another in green to report darkness. The night watches each contain 5 subdivisions. A jack wearing red appears at the beginning of the night watch, marking the first subdivision, while for the remaining 4 subdivisions, the jacks are all in green. In this way, there are 25 jacks for the 5 night watches. When the time of waiting for dawn comes, with its 10 quarters, a jack in green comes out to report this. Then dawn, with its 2.5 quarters, is marked by another jack wearing green, and a sunrise is reported by a jack wearing red. All these jacks appear in the central doorway. In 1090, this machine was ready to entertain and instruct the emperor and a few high officials in the palace grounds. When a new emperor came to power in 1094, his minions, following custom, declared the previous emperor's calendar to be faulty. No longer under the imperial protection, Su Sung's heavenly clockwork became a quarry of bronze for vandals, and it dissolved from the memories of the learned. When Ricci arrived in Peking, Chinese scholars of the court were dazzled by the wonderful European invention, which they considered something new under the sun. Ricci and Jesuit missionaries who came after him used their knowledge of astronomy and the calendrical sciences to secure influence within Chinese government. On his arrival, Ricci noted that the Chinese lunar calendar was in error, and it had been for centuries. The imperial astronomers had repeatedly erred in predicting the eclipse of the sun, which of course cast suspicion on the emperor's power to obey the will of heaven. The great opportunity for the Jesuits came when an eclipse was expected on the morning of June 21st, 1629. The imperial astronomers predicted that the eclipse would occur at 10:30 and would last for 2 hours. The Jesuits forecast that the eclipse would not come until 11:30 and would last only 2 minutes. On the crucial day, as 10:30 came and went, the sun shone in full brilliance. The imperial astronomers were wrong, but were the Jesuits right? Then, just at 11:30, the eclipse began and lasted for a brief 2 minutes, as the Jesuits had predicted. Their place in the emperor's confidence was now secure, and the door of China, which Ricci had set ajar, was open to the science of the West. The Imperial Board of Rites begged the emperor to command revision of the calendar, and on September 1st, the emperor ordered the Jesuits to begin the work. Incidentally, with their Chinese collaborators, they translated Western books on mathematics, optics, hydraulics, and music, and they began building telescopes for China. At the very moment when in Rome, Galileo was being tried by the Pope for his heresies, Jesuits in Peking were preaching the Galilean gospel. The skill and tact of a succession of Jesuit missionary astronomers made them intimates of the sons of heaven. They attained a power never equaled by foreigners there until the European advisors of Asian potentates came in the 19th century. It was their understanding of the calendar that opened the Jesuits' way to the imperial court. Yet it was not the calendar but the clock that opened a new commerce between West and East. In the West, the clock soon became an everyday occurrence, while in China, it long remained a toy. During the 18th century, clocks, watches, and clockwork toys became a treasured currency in European dealings with the Chinese imperial court. The young emperor Kangxi, the patron of Father Ferdinand Verbiest, was delighted to receive from the Jesuit Father Gabriel de Magalhaen a soldier automation motivated by clockwork, which flourished a sword in one hand while holding a shield in the other, and another clock, which played a melody after each hour was struck. The brilliant French missionary, Father Jean-Matthieu de Ventavon, produced for the emperor a legendary clockwork automation that could write in Manchu, Mongolian, and Tibetan. By the 1760s, the Jesuit father in charge of the emperor's collection reported that the imperial palace was, quote, stuffed with clocks, watches, carillons, repeaters, organs, spheres, and astronomical clocks of all kinds and description. There were more than 4,000 pieces from the best masters of Paris and London. Chinese emperors established their own factories and workshops for these charming toys. By the mid-18th century, the imperial clockworks employed 100 workers, but their product was not up to European standards. Because the Chinese could not make high-quality clock springs, they remained back in the age of weight-driven clocks. The first manual of clockmaking finally appeared in Chinese in 1809, when there were enough second-hand clocks in China to occupy hundreds of repairmen. As soon as the Europeans learned of the seductive appeal of clockwork in China, they set about to meet the demand. Clockwork toys of every conceivable shape and performing every imaginable trick poured into China. I have been appointed by the emperor as a clockmaker, the Jesuit Father Jean-Matthieu de Ventavon complained in 1769. But I should rather say that I am here as a machinist because the emperor expects me to produce not really clocks, but curious machines and automata. The ambassador of the Dutch East India Company in Peking at the end of the 18th century sent back to Holland advice that, quote, one should bring to Peking especially those playthings that European boys use to amuse themselves. Such objects will be received here with much greater interest than scientific instruments or objets d'art. The situation stirred the ingenuity and the knavery of European merchants and sounded the keynote for future Western relations with China. John Barrow, 1764 to 1848, founder of the Royal Geographical Society, a self-made man who became one of the great explorers of his age, in his Travels in China, 1804, helps us understand why Western merchants would be held in low esteem in China. He wrote, the gaudy watches of indifferent workmanship, fabricated purposefully for the China market and once in universal demand, are now scarcely asked for. One gentleman in the Honorable East India Company's employ took it into his head that cuckoo clocks might prove a saleable article in China, and accordingly laid in a large assortment, which more than answered his most sanguine expectations. But as these wooden machines were constructed for sale only and not for use, the cuckoo clocks became all mute long before the second arrival of this gentleman with another cargo. His clocks were now not only unsaleable, but the former purchasers threatened to return theirs upon his hands, which would certainly have been done had not a thought entered his head that not only pacified his former customers, but procured him also other purchasers for his second cargo. He convinced them by undeniable authorities that the cuckoo was a very odd kind of bird, which sung only at certain seasons of the year, and assured them that whenever the proper time arrived, all the cuckoos they had purchased would once again tune their melodious throats. After this, it would only be fair to allow the Chinese sometimes to trick the European purchaser with a wooden ham instead of a real one. In China, the man who could afford to gratify his taste for these curious baubles was not satisfied to have only one. If he possessed a clock at all, he was likely to be a collector. And he was likely to use it as a time marker. When there were so few public clocks and so few people carrying watches, a timepiece was not much use in daily intercourse. One Jesuit watchmaker stationed in Peking reported the Chinese gentleman's custom of carrying several watches because they were anxious, which they were anxious should always harmonize. A grandson of the emperor in Barrow's time had collected at least a dozen watches. In the mid-19th century, a British doctor in China noted that clocks were seldom seen except in public offices, where it was not uncommon to see as many as half a dozen clocks in a row, with few, if any, in working order.